Please like, share, and subscribe. Wishing you happiness and good luck every day.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a huge topic, one that's at the heart of pretty much everything we do. We're diving into Mauboussin's incredible book, The Success Equation, to try and untangle two of the most powerful and most misunderstood forces in our lives, skill and luck.
And you know, the best way to kick this off is with a story from the author himself. It's summed up by this one quote, and it just perfectly frames the puzzle we're trying to solve today. You know, that messy, complicated dance between being good at something and just getting plain lucky.
All right, so picture this. The story kicks off with a super high-stakes, final-round job interview. We're talking about the powerhouse investment bank, Drexel Burnham Lambert. Mauboussin, he's fresh out of college, and I mean, this is the interview, the one that could change everything.
So he's already gone through 6 interviews that day, and honestly, they were just, okay, kind of forgettable. The last hurdle is just a quick 10-minute chat with the head of the whole division. So he walks into this big, fancy office, and what does he see? Something totally random. A Washington Redskins trash can. Now, Mauboussin's a sports fan, so he just casually mentions it, and boom, that one little comment turns a 10-minute formality into a 15-minute deep dive on football. And guess what? He got the job. A job that would define his entire career.
But wait, it gets better. This is the real kicker. A few months into the job, one of the program leaders pulls him aside and tells him what really happened. Turns out, all 6 of those initial interviewers, they had all voted no. They didn't want to hire him. The big boss, the one with the trash can, he just overruled everyone, all because of that one chat about sports. His whole career path was literally decided by a lucky glance at a garbage can.
And that just perfectly sets up the question we're all here to figure out, right? Was that success? I mean, was spotting the trash can some kind of brilliant social skill, or was it just pure, dumb, random luck that the exec happened to be a fan of that exact same team?
So, to really answer that, we need a better way to think about this. We need some kind of framework, right? A way to see where skill stops and luck takes over.
Okay, so here's a really simple, almost genius test the book offers up. Think about it. In an activity that's all about skill, like say chess or tennis, you can totally lose on purpose, right? Easy. But now think about an activity that's pure luck, like playing the lottery or roulette. Can you try to lose? Nope. You have literally zero control over the outcome.
And that's the key right there. Most things in life, in our careers, in our hobbies, they're not one or the other. They're not pure luck or pure skill. They live somewhere in the middle, on this long spectrum, this continuum, with a mix of both.
Let's make this real with an example we all get. Professional sports. Just for a second, where would you put different sports on that line? Think about it.
So, where do they actually fall? Well, the research is pretty clear. A sport like basketball, where you have tons of scoring plays, is way over on the skills side of the line. The better team wins a lot. But then you look at something like American football or hockey, and luck plays a much bigger role. A weird bounce of the puck, a single turnover, a fumble, that can decide the entire game, even if one team is clearly better.
Okay, so if we can map it out for sports, why are we so bad at seeing this in our own lives, in our careers, in business? Well, the answer is all in our heads. It's about how our brains are wired. See, our minds are basically story-making machines. They hate a vacuum. We have this deep need to connect the dots, to build a neat little narrative where A causes B. And because of that, we often just completely write randomness out of the script. One of the biggest traps is something called the post hoc fallacy. It sounds complicated, but it's super simple. It's that feeling of, hey, I wore my lucky socks and my team won. The socks did it. Our brains just love that simple cause and effect story, even when it's totally bogus. We're seeing a connection that isn't really there.
And then there's this other one called creeping determinism. This is basically hindsight bias on steroids. It's when we look back at something that happened, like a big success, and we go, oh, of course that was going to happen. It was obvious. We totally forget how uncertain things felt before it happened, all the different ways it could have gone wrong.
Now this next one, this one is huge. It's called the undersampling of failure. Think about it. We obsess over the winners, right? We read biographies of successful CEOs, we study championship teams, but we completely ignore the massive graveyard of people who did the exact same things and failed just because they got a bad break. We're only looking at the survivors, and that gives us a totally warped picture of what it takes to succeed. Okay, so all of this leads to a really fascinating kind of mind-bending idea. It's called the paradox of skill.
And the question is this: what happens when everybody in a field gets really, really good at what they do?
Let's go back to baseball for a second. Hitting 400 for a season used to be the gold standard, the absolute peak of greatness. The last person to ever do it was the legendary Ted Williams way back in 1941. Nobody has done it since.
So, why? Did the hitters just get worse? No, not at all. The opposite happened. Everybody else, the pitchers throwing faster, the fielders being more athletic, the coaches using better strategy, they all got unbelievably better.
Exactly. As things like training, nutrition, and just the sheer size of the talent pool improved, the difference between the absolute best players and the just pretty good players got smaller and smaller. The whole group's skill level got compressed, squeezed together at the very top.
And that, right there, is the paradox of skill. It's so counterintuitive. As the overall skill level in a field goes up, luck actually becomes more important in deciding who wins and who loses. When everyone is an expert, the tiny little things, a lucky bounce, a gust of wind, are what make the difference. The role of luck gets bigger, not smaller.
Okay, so what do we do with all this information? How are we supposed to approach our own goals, knowing that luck plays this huge, unavoidable role?
Well, this quote from Richard Epstein really just nails it. The idea is that it's actually better to lose intelligently than to win ignorantly. It's not just about the win. It's about having a process that's so solid, you know you're making the right moves, no matter what the final score is.
Because, think about it. When luck's involved, you can make a brilliant decision and still get a bad result. And on the flip side, you can make a totally boneheaded move and get bailed out by pure luck. You can't ever fully control the outcome. But you can control your process, and in the long run, a solid, repeatable process is really the only thing that's going to lead to consistent success.
So we'll leave you with this one question to chew on. Think about your last big success, your last major win, whether it was at work or in your personal life, and be really honest with yourself. How much of that was pure skill, and how much of it was just a little bit of luck going your way?
All right, welcome. Today, we're going to tackle a really big question, one that sits at the heart of pretty much every success or failure you can think of. How much of it was skill, and how much was just plain old luck? To really get into this, I want to start with a story. So, take a second and think about this. When I say the dawn of the personal computer, who's the first person that pops into your head? You've probably got a name already, right? Well, let's see if that guess is the right one. Okay, so our story starts probably just like you'd expect, with this absolutely brilliant programmer from the Seattle area. We're talking about the 1970s here, and this guy was one of the very first people to really see the future, to understand just how revolutionary it was to put a whole computer onto a tiny little chip. So what does he do? He immediately starts a software company. And look, he wasn't just early to the party, he was the party. He was dominant. By 1981, his operating system was the standard for PCs. His company was just taking off, and it had this kind of zany, walk around barefoot in the office vibe. And then, the big one, the moment that changes everything. It's the summer of 1980, and the absolute giant of the industry, IBM, comes knocking. They need an operating system for their brand new PC. A deal is struck, and just like that, history is made. Now, I bet you're thinking, okay, I know exactly who this is. But here's where the story takes a sharp turn. The guy I'm talking about, he didn't end up becoming the richest man in the world, not even close. Instead, his life took a tragic turn, and he died at just 52 years old after an incident at a biker bar. His name was Gary Kildall. See, a few fateful moments, a missed meeting with IBM, a mistake on pricing, that's all it took. It swung the door wide open for his main competitor, Bill Gates. Now, Gates made some really smart moves, for sure, but even he admitted that without some great luck, Microsoft's incredible success just wouldn't have happened. And that story, the story of Gary Kildall, it's the perfect setup for our big question today. If we really want to understand what separates success from failure, we've got to get super clear on what we're talking about. So, let's nail down some definitions. First up, luck. What is it, really? Well, just think of it as anything that happens to you that's totally out of your control and pretty much unpredictable. Here's a good rule of thumb I like. If you can honestly say, yeah, that could have gone a different way, then you're probably looking at luck. Now, skill is the other side of that coin. It's your ability to actually use what you know to get things done. It's the part you control. But here's the really crucial part to get. Whenever luck is in the mix, having great skill, a great process, doesn't guarantee a great result. At least, not right away. Okay, to make this super clear, let me introduce you to Charlie the student. Let's say Charlie's skill is set in stone. He studied hard and he knows 80 out of 100 facts for his big test. But then the teacher throws a wrench in the works, luck. She only picks 20 questions and they're chosen totally at random. All of a sudden, Charlie's grade can go anywhere. Even with 80% skill, he could totally bomb the test, or he could ace it with a perfect 100. And it all just comes down to the luck of the draw. So you see, this whole thing was skill and luck. It's not just a simple choice. It's not either or. Actually, the best way to visualize this is to think of it as a spectrum, a continuum. On one end, you have pure 100% luck, and on the other end, pure 100% skill. And I want you to try this right now. Think about your job or maybe a sport you love to play. Ask yourself, is it more like chess, where success is pretty much all about skill? Or is it more like playing the lottery, where it's all just random chance? The truth is, most things in life fall somewhere in the middle, don't they? And here's what that spectrum looks like. Way over on the right, you've got your pure skill activities. Think running a 100-meter dash or a game of chess. The better player, the better athlete, they're going to win almost every single time. Then, way over on the left, you've got pure luck. Things like roulette or buying a lottery ticket. But most of what we do in life, business, investing, even team sports, it all lives right here in the middle, in that messy space where skill and luck are always tangled up together. Now, figuring out where an activity falls on this line is so important. Why? Because when we get it wrong, we make some huge mistakes in how we see the world. The truth is, we get fooled by random chance all the time. You know, the statistician Howard Weiner talks about what he calls the most dangerous equation, and what it really boils down to is this simple, powerful truth. Anytime luck is involved, small sample sizes will give you wild, extreme results. Just think about flipping a coin, right? If you flip it only 3 times, getting 3 heads in a row, it's not that weird. But if you flip that same coin 1,000 times, you're gonna land pretty darn close to a 50-50 split. Small sample sizes are just noisy. Here's a perfect example. Researchers were scratching their heads when they saw that the counties with the absolute lowest rates of kidney cancer all had a few things in common. They were mostly rural, didn't have a lot of people, and were in specific parts of the country. So naturally, everyone started thinking, oh, it must be that clean, healthy country living. But then they decided to look at the counties with the highest rates of kidney cancer. And what did they find? The exact same thing. Rural, small populations, same parts of the country. So, what on earth is going on? See, it had nothing to do with lifestyle. It was all about sample size. Small counties are just small samples. And what do small samples do? They produce extreme results. They'll always pop up at the very top and the very bottom of any list. It's not a mystery, it's just statistics. And this idea leads us right into another hugely important concept, reversion to the mean. It sounds complicated, but the idea is simple. In any game that's a mix of skill and luck, if you get an extreme result, either amazing or terrible, the next result is much more likely to be closer to your average. Just look at sports. Compare tennis to baseball. Tennis is way over on the skill end of the spectrum, right? So the top players tend to stay at the top. Reversion to the mean is really slow. But baseball? Oh, baseball has a ton of luck mixed in. Even the very best teams lose about 40% of their games. Rankings can go all over the place from one year to the next. In baseball, reversion to the mean is fast, and it is powerful. Okay, so what's the big takeaway here? The real point is figuring out how we can use this framework in our own lives, right? How can we use it to make sense of our own results and hopefully make better decisions going forward? So here are the 3 big things to remember. Number 1, be super careful about drawing big, sweeping conclusions from a tiny bit of data. Number 2, if luck is a huge factor in what you do, you have to expect that amazing hot streak or that terrible cold streak is eventually going to end. And finally, number 3, before you rush to copy some super successful person or company, you have to stop and ask yourself, were they really that skilled, or did they just get really, really lucky? But it's also really important to know where this way of thinking has its limits. The writer Nassim Taleb talks about this a lot. He points out that while all this statistical stuff is great for normal, predictable things, it can completely fall apart when we're hit with what he calls a black swan. You know, those incredibly rare, totally unpredictable events that change everything. It's a good reminder that we can't model everything. Some things are just wild. So that leaves us with one last kind of tough question to ask ourselves. Think about your last big win, your last major success, maybe at work or in your personal life. Now be honest, how much of that was really your skill? And how much of it was just being in the right place at the right time? Figuring out how to separate those two, well, that's the first step to really understanding how the world works.
You know, we're constantly hearing these stories about success. The brilliant CEO, the genius investor, the winning coach, right? But have you ever stopped to wonder how much of that is genuine, actual skill? And how much is just plain old luck? Well, in this explainer, we're going to dig into why our brains are so surprisingly bad at telling the difference.
So to kick things off, let's try a little experiment. I'm sure you've all heard Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven, but what happens when you play it backward? Go on, listen really closely. Do you hear a secret message in there?
So, what did you get? If you're like most people, you probably heard, well, nothing, right? Just a jumbled, chaotic mess of backward noise. No clear words, no phrases, just gibberish. Okay, hold that thought.
But what if I told you exactly what to listen for? Let's try this one more time. This time, as you listen, read the words on your screen. Whoa, it's totally different now, isn't it? All of a sudden, the noise transforms. The words seem to just pop right out, clear as day. The gibberish becomes a coherent and, let's be honest, pretty creepy message.
So what's going on here? This isn't really about secret messages in classic rock songs. It's about our minds. It's about us. We have this incredibly powerful, automatic drive to find patterns and create stories to make sense of the world, especially when someone gives us the story to look for. And this powerful tendency, it isn't just some weird quirk, it's a fundamental part of how our brain is built. To really understand why, we need to meet the little storyteller that lives inside all of our heads.
Check out this classic experiment by neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga. A split-brain patient is shown two different images. Their right brain sees a snowy scene, so their left hand, which the right brain controls, picks a shovel. At the same time, their left brain sees a chicken foot, so their right hand picks a chicken. Simple enough. But here's the kicker. When the patient is asked why they picked a shovel, their left brain, which only knows about the chicken, just invents a story right on the spot. Oh, that's easy. You need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed.
Gazzaniga named this internal storyteller the interpreter. It's a part of our left hemisphere that's working 24/7 to create a coherent story out of everything we experience. It has this deep, deep need to find a cause for every single effect, even if it has to completely invent one.
And here's the crucial part. This isn't just happening in split-brain patients. It is happening in all of us all the time. As a psychologist Steven Pinker puts it, our conscious mind is a spin doctor, not the commander-in-chief. It's constantly creating stories to explain the impulses and actions coming from the rest of our brain.
Now, this internal spin doctor leads us into two major traps. The first is called the post-hoc fallacy. It's basically, I wore my lucky tie and my team won, so the tie must have caused the win. The second is creeping determinism. This is when we look back at something that happened and think, oh, of course that was going to happen. We see it as completely inevitable, and we totally forget the massive role that chance played along the way.
So, how does this all play out in the real world? Let's take a look at the world of business, an area that is completely obsessed with finding the secret formula for success.
You've seen all the business books that study successful companies and tell us to just copy their strategies. But there's a huge problem with that logic. It's a bias called undersampling of failure. We only study the winners. For every one company that used a risky strategy and got lucky, there could be dozens of others that tried the exact same thing and went bankrupt. But because they failed, they're invisible to us.
And that's when our interpreter brain kicks in. It sees the successful company, ignores all those invisible failures, and it creates this nice, neat story. The success was caused by a brilliant strategy. We end up attributing everything to skill and completely discount the massive role that pure dumb luck played in that survival. The Sony mini disc is just a perfect example. I mean, on paper, the strategy was flawless. It was a better product. It was backed by Sony's massive resources. But then, an unforeseeable wave of bad luck just hits out of nowhere. Cheap memory, broadband internet, and MP3s. The entire problem the mini disc was designed to solve. It just vanished. This wasn't a bad strategy. It was a brilliant strategy that got completely sunk by a tidal wave of chance.
And this isn't just about business. These same narrative traps can lead us astray even in the super rigorous world of scientific research.
So the work of Dr. John Ioannidis shows this huge gap in the reliability of scientific research.
He found that randomized trials, the gold standard for finding true cause and effect, are reliable about 75% of the time. But observational studies, the ones that just look for correlations, are wrong or exaggerated over 80% of the time. Why the massive difference? Because just looking for correlations is a perfect way to find false patterns in random noise.
And this is exactly how you end up with headlines like this one, which, by the way, is from a real published study. It got a ton of media attention, but was the finding actually real?
Yeah, probably not. Turns out the finding was just a statistical illusion. The researchers tested for links between 264 different foods and the baby's gender. Here's the thing. If you test that many things, you are guaranteed to find a few connections just by pure random chance. It's like they say, if you torture the data long enough, it'll confess. It's just like that backwards Zeppelin song. If you listen hard enough for something, you're bound to hear it.
Okay, finally, let's bring this all the way down to the individual level. We all love the story of the star performer, that brilliant hire who's going to come in and change a company's fortunes. But is that star power really portable?
Research from Harvard's Boris Groysberg uncovered something absolutely stunning. When star Wall Street analysts switched firms, their performance didn't just dip, it plunged, and it stayed down for at least 5 years. It turns out their skill wasn't nearly as portable as everyone assumed. They had left behind the specific resources, the colleagues, and the company culture that were the hidden ingredients to their success.
A great sports analogy makes this crystal clear. In the NFL, when a star wide receiver changes teams, their performance often drops off a cliff. Their skill is system-dependent. It relies on the quarterback, the playbook, the whole organization. But a punter, their performance stays rock solid no matter what team they're on. Their skill is almost entirely independent. It's truly portable.
So let's pull all this together. Our brains are powerful storytelling machines, hardwired to look for causes. And this is what leads us to mistake correlation for causation, to worship the strategies of lucky survivors, and to assume an individual's skill is entirely their own, when in reality, it's often deeply, deeply tied to their specific environment. So the next time you see a story of great success or some spectacular failure, just pause and ask yourself, was it brilliant skill? Was it just a lucky break? Or am I just hearing a really, really good story from the interpreter inside my own head? Let's talk about something tricky, the line between skill and pure, dumb luck. When you see someone do something amazing, how can you tell if they're a genius or if they just caught a lucky break? Well, that's exactly what we're going to untangle today. So let's kick things off with a story that sounds like the beginning of a bad joke. Back in 2006, a financial company asked 10 Playboy playmates to pick 5 stocks apiece. You can just imagine the seasoned pros on Wall Street having a good laugh about that. But nobody was laughing when the results came in, because the winner, a playmate named Deanna Brooks, didn't just do okay. Her picks returned a staggering 43.4% in 1 year.
Now, just to put that number into perspective, the S&P 500, the benchmark for the whole market, it only went up 13.6% that year. She didn't just beat the market, she more than tripled its return.
And get this, it wasn't just some one-off fluke. 4 out of the 10 playmates actually beat the S&P 500. For comparison's sake, less than a third of professional, highly paid money managers did that well. So what gives? This brings us right to the heart of the matter. How in the world is this possible? Was Deanna Brooks secretly a stock-picking savant, or did she just get unbelievably, fantastically lucky? This is the exact puzzle we're here to figure out. Okay, to even begin to unpack that, we need a mental model. So let's start with a really powerful framework for looking at the world, the luck-skill continuum. The idea is actually pretty simple. Think about it. Almost nothing we do is 100% skill, like a game of chess, or 100% luck, like spinning a roulette wheel. Nope. Most of life, investing, sports, your career, it all happens somewhere in that messy middle. And this chart really shows us why it's so important to know where something falls on that spectrum. Along the bottom, you've got the continuum from total luck to pure skill. And going up the side, you've got the amount of evidence you have. The main takeaway is this. For stuff on the mostly luck side, seeing someone succeed once or twice means almost nothing. But for stuff on the skill side, a little bit of success can be pretty telling. But how do we actually picture this weird mix of luck and skill in a single event? Well, that brings us to a really simple but awesome way to think about it, the 2-jar model. I want you to imagine you've got 2 jars in front of you.
One jar is filled with little slips of paper, and each one represents your skill. The other jar is filled with slips representing luck. Any given outcome in your life is basically like reaching into each jar, pulling out one number, and just adding them together.
So visually, the contents of each jar kind of look like these bell curves. You have a range of possible skill levels you can perform at and a whole range of luck, both good and bad, that might hit you on any given day.
All right, let's make this super concrete. Let's say your skill is a solid 3. You're pretty good. But on this one particular day, you reach into that luck jar and you pull out a big ol' -4. That dose of bad luck completely cancels out your skill, and you end up with a final score of -1. This is exactly how a really talented person can have a really bad day.
Okay, now hang on, because this is where things get really, really weird and kind of backward. It's something called the paradox of skill, and it explains why, as people get better at something, luck can actually start to matter more.
So here's the mind-bending idea. In any competitive field you can think of, as everyone gets more and more skilled, their actual performances get closer and closer together. The gap between the best and the just pretty good shrinks. And when everyone is an absolute expert, what's left to decide who wins? Often, it's just random chance.
To really get this, let's look at a classic sports puzzle. In Major League Baseball, why has literally no one hit for a .400 average for a whole season since Ted Williams did it way back in 1941? Are players today just worse? No, it's actually the complete opposite. The players today are, on average, way more skillful. What this chart shows is the spread of batting averages over the decades, and you can see that spread has been consistently shrinking. As the players got better, they also got more alike. The worst player isn't that far off from the best player anymore.
And by the way, this isn't just some weird baseball thing. You see this exact same pattern showing up in pretty much any competitive field you can measure, whether it's business, investing, or any other sport.
I mean, just look at the Olympic marathon. That solid line shows the winning times have gotten way, way faster over the years. That's absolute skill going up. But now look at the dash line. That's the gap between first place and 20th place. It's totally collapsed. Everyone is running in a much tighter pack.
So here's the bottom line. When a field is just packed with world-class experts, all using the best techniques and training, the tiny little thing that separates the winner from everyone else often comes down to who caught a lucky break on that specific day.
All right, so we've got this continuum, we've got this paradox. What's the point? How do we actually use this knowledge? Well, that brings us to the final and most practical piece of the puzzle. What happens next, and something called reversion to the mean. Reversion to the mean is a super fundamental idea in statistics. And all it really says is that extreme results, whether they're extremely good or extremely bad, tend to be followed by results that are much closer to the average. That incredible hot streak or that horrible string of bad luck, it usually doesn't last. And this is where it all clicks together. Where an activity lands on our luck-skill continuum tells us how fast we should expect that reversion to happen. The more luck is involved in something, the quicker and more dramatically things are going to snap back to the average. We can actually think about this with numbers, using something called a shrinking factor. For a pure skill game like checkers, the factor is basically 1. Past performance is an excellent predictor of future performance. But look at baseball batting, where luck is a huge deal. The factor is only about 0.2. That means you have to shrink a player's amazing season almost all the way back down to the average to get a realistic prediction for next year. And stock investing? Whoa. The factor is almost 0. The best prediction for next year's performance is simply the average. Once you really get this framework, it's a super powerful tool for just making better judgments about everything. And it forces you to ask a really important question. Where in your own life are you mistaking a streak of good luck for undeniable genius?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating question. Where's that hidden line between pure skill and just plain old blind luck? So, let's just start with two extremes, right? On one side, you've got rowing, a sport where every single ounce of effort counts. Skill is everything. And on the other side, a slot machine where, let's be honest, the outcome is pretty much all chance. You know, there's actually this rowing coach who forbids anyone from saying good luck to his team. No way! He makes them say good effort because he believes skill, not chance, is what wins races. But that makes you wonder, right? Where do most of the things we do in life fall? All right, so here's what we're going to do. We'll start by looking at the puzzle itself, do a quick gut check, then let the data decide. After that, we'll hit a really cool paradox, and finally, bring it all back to things like sports and stocks. Okay, so the first big idea to wrap your head around is this. It's not a simple choice between luck or skill. You got to stop thinking of it like that. Almost everything we do is a mix of both, lying somewhere on this spectrum, this continuum. So how do we figure out where something lands on that spectrum? Well, we can start with a pretty simple gut check. It just comes down to asking 3 key questions. First up, can you actually see a clear link between cause and effect? I mean, if you do X, does Y consistently happen? So if that connection is super obvious, like you practice watching the ball on your tennis return and your return gets better, well, you're definitely on the skills side of things. But if the link is, let's say, unclear, like winning at roulette only when you're wearing your quote-unquote lucky hat, yeah, you're way over in luck territory. All right, question number 2. How fast does someone's performance snap back to average? You know, think about streaks, good or bad. Do they last a long time or do they just disappear? This is a really crucial point. In areas where skill is dominant, that reversion back to the average is slow. Top performers tend to stay on top for a while. But in things driven by luck, whoa, that reversion is rapid. Today's big winner could easily be just average tomorrow. And that brings us to our third and final gut check question. Can the experts in a field actually predict what's going to happen? I mean, when expert predictions are highly accurate, think about chess, where player ratings are incredible at predicting who will win a match. That's a huge sign that skill is the main driver. But when the experts are just consistently wrong, I mean, look at all the people who try to predict stock market moves. Well, then you know you're dealing with a system that has a ton of luck involved. All right, so those gut checks are a great starting point. But now let's move beyond that and get a little more precise. Let's let the hard numbers do the talking. And for that, professional sports make for a perfect laboratory. So check this out. We can simulate 2 completely imaginary NFL seasons. In one world, it's all luck. Every single game is just a 50-50 coin flip. In the other world, it's all skill. The better team, the higher-ranked team, is guaranteed to win. No exceptions. Okay, so what's really interesting is when you look at the actual results from real NFL seasons, guess what? It doesn't look like either of those extremes. Not at all. The reality is, well, it's somewhere in the middle. So to figure this out, what you have to do is create a blended model, one that mixes some of that all-luck world with some of the all-skill world. And the exact blend that perfectly matches the real-world data, well, that tells you exactly how much of the game is luck. And for the NFL, what's that number? It's 48%. Just let that sink in for a second. Almost half of a team's entire season record can be chalked up to good or bad luck. And what's really cool is that a totally different statistical method confirms this and lets us rank other sports. So you've got the NBA, where luck is only about 12% of the outcome. That's a game of skill for sure. But then you look at the NHL. It's 53% luck. That means the outcome is literally more luck than skill. It's basically a coin flip on ice. Okay, now this leads us to something absolutely fascinating. It's a bit of a twist, and it's called the paradox of skill. And here it is. It's kind of counterintuitive. As the overall skill level in any group gets higher and higher, luck actually starts to matter more in determining who wins. So just imagine you're building a sports league, but you can only draft players from one tiny town, right? You'd probably get a few really amazing athletes and then a lot of pretty average players. The gap in skill between the best and the worst would be massive. But now, what if you can recruit from the whole country or the whole world? Suddenly, the average skill level just skyrockets. The difference between the best player and the, quote, worst player becomes tiny because now everybody is a world-class expert. And that's the paradox right there. When all the competitors are nearly equal in skill, what separates winning from losing? It's those tiny, random things. A lucky bounce of the ball, a sudden gust of wind. It's just luck. So when everyone is an expert, luck becomes the great decider. So, okay, why should you care about any of this? Well, because this whole framework, this whole way of thinking applies directly to things we deal with every day. Business, investing, you name it. Just think about that continuum we talked about. A repetitive task in a factory? That's almost pure skill. You can measure it, you can improve it. But what about something like corporate strategy or investing? Well, remember our gut checks? They have that strong reversion to the mean, and experts are terrible at predicting outcomes. So yeah, they fall much, much closer to the luck side of the spectrum. And this is the big takeaway. This is the so what. You absolutely have to match your strategy to where your activity lands on that spectrum, right? The way you approach chess, a high skill game, would be a total disaster if you applied it to the stock market, which is way more luck driven. So I'll leave you with this question. Think about your career, your industry, maybe even your hobbies. Where do they fall on this luck skill spectrum? And more importantly, are you using the right strategy? So I want you to think about any skill you have. Seriously, anything. Playing an instrument, coding, hitting a baseball, whatever it is, that skill follows this really predictable path. It rises, it hits a peak, and then, it eventually starts to fall. We're going to call this the arc of skill. And we're going to break down what it means for athletes, for our own minds, and even for giant companies. Our story actually kicks off in the world of professional baseball. Back in 2010, one player signed a contract so huge it made rival managers like Sandy Alderson just shake their heads. His take on it was pretty blunt. It's a long time and a lot of money. And let me tell you, he was not exaggerating. The number? $126 million. That's what the Washington Nationals promised an outfielder named Jason Worth for 7 years of work. Now, here's the key detail. At the time, Worth was 31 years old, and he was coming off like the best season of his entire career. And that, right there, is the central question of this whole thing. The Nationals were essentially betting a fortune that Worth's best days were still to come. They were planning to pay him over $20 million a year when he was pushing 40. So was this a brilliant move or a massive, massive gamble against time itself? You see, this Jason Worth contract is the perfect way to really dig into this arc of skill. His team was betting he could beat the odds. But as we're about to find out, the odds, based on cold, hard biology and physics, were stacked against him from the moment he signed. Let's start with the physical side of things. For any athlete, your biggest opponent isn't the other team. It's the clock. It's father time. And for a baseball player, that battle is fought in the tiniest fractions of a second. To really get what a player like Worth is up against, just try to imagine hitting a 95-mile-per-hour fastball. It is, no joke, one of the hardest things to do in all of sports. It takes this incredible blend of vision, brain power, and sheer physical force. So get this. From the moment the ball leaves the pitcher's hand, you have 400 milliseconds before it hits the catcher's mitt. That's less than half a second. In that tiny window, your brain has to find the ball, figure out where it's going, decide to swing, and then actually do it. And the window to hit it fair? A laughable 7 milliseconds. So how on earth is this even possible? Well, elite athletes basically have biological superpowers. The average pro baseball player has 20/13 vision. That means they can see something clearly from 20 feet away that you or I would need to be at 13 feet to see. And all their explosive power? That comes from something called fast-twitch muscle fibers, which are built for pure speed. And here's the cruel twist. The two things that make an elite hitter are the first things to decline with age. Our vision gets worse, and those super important fast-twitch muscle fibers literally shrink and disappear. The slide down that physical arc is pretty much a biological guarantee. And you don't have to take my word for it, just look at the data. This chart shows the typical peak ages for athletes in a bunch of different sports. See baseball right there? The peak is between 27 and 29. Now remember Jason Worth? He signed that monster contract at age 31. He was already on the other side of the mountain. Okay, so the body declines. Fair enough. But what about the mind? Can't experience and wisdom make up for a slower bat? Well, let's pivot to the cognitive arc and see what happens to our brains as we get older. To really get this, we have to talk about two kinds of intelligence. First, there's fluid intelligence. Think of this as your brain's raw processing power, your ability to solve brand new problems you've never seen before. Then there's crystallized intelligence. This is your library of knowledge, all the facts and experience you've gathered over the years. And here's the big trade-off. Your fluid intelligence, that raw problem-solving speed, actually peaks when you're around 20 and then starts a long, slow decline. But at the same time, your crystallized intelligence, your mental library, just keeps growing and growing for decades. Our overall performance, then, is this constant balancing act between these two curves. So as our raw processing power fades, our brains do something clever to adapt. We become what psychologists call cognitive misers. It means we try to save mental energy by relying on intuition and shortcuts that have worked for us in the past. But this can also lead us into some predictable traps. All right, let's put this to the test. I want you to look at this riddle. Take a second and really think it through. Is a married person looking at an unmarried person? Is it yes, no, or cannot be determined? Now, most people's gut reaction is to jump to C, but the answer is actually A, yes. And get this, more than 80% of people get it wrong. So why is that? It's our cognitive miser brain taking a shortcut. We don't know Anne's marital status, so we think it's impossible to know. But think about it. If Anne is unmarried, then married Jack is looking at her. If Anne is married, then she's looking at unmarried George. Either way, the statement is true. And hey, this isn't just a fun party trick. Studies show that our ability to override that faulty first instinct, it's called cognitive reflection, measurably goes down as we age. You can see it right here in the numbers. The percentage of people who get these kinds of problems right drops steadily as you go from your 40s into your 70s and beyond. So with all that in mind, where does our overall decision-making ability peak? Researchers looked at complex financial decisions, like avoiding fees and getting good interest rates, and they found that the peak performance age, on average, is remarkably consistent, and that age is 53. After that, our ability to juggle all those variables starts its own slow slide down the arc. Now here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just about individuals. The exact same arc of skill applies to entire organizations. That's right, even the most innovative, successful companies eventually get old and see their performance start to dip. Take a look at this graph of the typical corporate life cycle. Does that curve look familiar? It should. It's the same rise, peak, and fall we've been talking about this whole time. Companies are born, they innovate, they hit their stride, and then, over time, competition and reality pull their returns back down to earth. And what causes this? It's a phenomenon called organizational rigidity. Basically, companies get really, really good at doing the thing that made them successful. They exploit that success, but in the process, they forget how to explore new ideas. They become corporate cognitive misers, relying on old rules in a world that's constantly changing. Okay. Let's bring it all back to where we started, that massive $126 million contract. We've looked at the physical arc, we've looked at the cognitive arc. So what's the final verdict on the Jason Worth gamble? When you look at all the evidence, the Nationals made a classic multi-million-dollar mistake. They saw a player at his absolute, undeniable peak, and they paid for his past performance, just assuming it would continue into the future. They completely ignored the powerful, predictable forces of the arc of skill. They bet against Father Time. And in the long run, Father Time always cashes in. This arc of rising, peaking, and falling isn't just for athletes or companies. It applies to all of us, in pretty much every part of our lives. It's not a bad thing, it's just a fundamental pattern of how we learn and grow. So the real question this leaves us with isn't if you're on an arc. It's where are you on your arc, and what are you preparing for next?
Have you ever wondered why one song becomes this massive global hit, while another that sounds almost exactly the same just disappears? Is the winner just that much better, or is there some other powerful invisible force at play? Well, today, we're going to try and solve the success equation and unpack the huge and frankly misunderstood role of luck.
All right, so to kick things off, let's look at a tale of two massive bets made in the entertainment world. One of them looked like a guaranteed surefire hit. The other? Well, it was pretty much considered a total disaster before it even got started.
So in one corner, you've got Carly Hennessy. The record label thought she was the next big thing, a can't-miss superstar. In the other corner, you have the TV show Lost. And I'm not kidding, the head of Disney, the parent company, literally said the idea was terrible. So yeah, two very, very different starting points.
And the record label didn't just talk the talk. They put a cool $2.2 million behind Carly Hennessy. That's a staggering amount of money to pour into a brand new artist. It was a huge bet. So what did they get for all that cash? 378 copies in its first 3 months. Oof. I mean, that's not just a flop, it's a full-on catastrophe.
Meanwhile, that terrible show, Lost, yeah? It went on to average almost 16 million viewers per episode in its very first season.
It wasn't just a hit, it became a cultural phenomenon. So what gives? How could the experts, with all the money and the data, get it so spectacularly wrong? Now, the easy answer is to say, well, she just wasn't talented and the show is genius. But honestly, that's missing the entire point. This isn't really a story about talent versus no talent. It's a story about how fundamentally we misunderstand the way luck actually works. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to realize that luck isn't just one simple thing. It actually comes in two totally different flavors. And understanding that difference, well, it changes absolutely everything. Okay, so first up, you've got simple luck. These are things with independent outcomes. Think of flipping a coin. The coin has no memory, right? It doesn't care if it landed on heads the last 5 times. Each flip is its own separate little world. But then there's complex luck, where outcomes are dependent. This is the world of viral videos. The more people that watch it, the more it gets recommended, and the more other people are likely to watch it. The system remembers what came before.
Baseball is a perfect example of that first type, that simple luck. We all love to talk about players on a hot streak. So some statisticians decided to test that. They basically created 2 models, Mr. Consistent, whose skill level is fixed and his hits are just random luck, and Mr. Streaky, whose skill actually goes up after he gets a hit.
And guess which model perfectly matched the stats of real-life baseball players? It was Mr. Consistent. Those hot streaks we all see are mostly just illusions, patterns our brains create out of pure randomness. So in these kinds of systems, luck tends to even out over time. But what happens when the outcomes aren't independent? Well, that's where things get really weird.
Right, let's leave the nice, orderly world of baseball and jump into the messy, unpredictable world of social influence. This is where luck stops playing by the rules and becomes this incredibly powerful, wild force. The first big idea here is something called cumulative advantage. You know it as the rich get richer effect. A song gets a few early downloads, which makes it more visible on a playlist, which leads to more downloads, and on and on. A tiny, lucky head start can literally snowball into a gigantic success.
And there's a super simple game with marbles that shows this perfectly. So, picture a jar. The red marbles are the favorite. There are the most of them. Blue is the long shot. There's only one. Here's the rule. You draw a marble, note its color, and then you put it back in the jar, along with another marble of the exact same color. So every time red gets picked, its advantage gets even bigger.
So when researchers ran a simulation of this, wow, just look at this. These are 3 separate results from the exact same starting conditions. In one, red, the favorite, wins easily. No surprise. But in another, yellow, a middle-of-the-pack color, ends up on top. And get this, in the third run, blue, the ultimate long shot, somehow wins the whole thing. It's just proof that a tiny bit of luck right at the beginning can completely change the final outcome. The second mechanism is what we call a tipping point. Think about water turning into ice. At 1 degree, it's liquid. At exactly 0 degrees, bam, it's solid. It's a huge change from a tiny nudge. Social systems work the same way. An idea can simmer for a while, but then one little thing pushes it over a critical threshold, and suddenly its success is just unstoppable. So this is all cool in theory, right? But is there any proof this actually happens in the real world? Well, let me tell you about a brilliant experiment that put all of this to the test using something we can all relate to: music.
Okay, so researchers set up this thing called Music Lab. They got thousands of people to listen to songs by unknown bands. They split the participants into groups. One group was the independent world. They just saw the songs, nothing else. But everyone else was split into 8 different social worlds. In those worlds, you could see which songs were popular with the other people in your group. It was basically like creating 8 parallel universes of music. And the results were, frankly, they were stunning. I mean, sure, quality mattered a little bit. The truly awful songs never became hits. But here's the kicker. For any song that was just good enough, its quality basically stopped mattering. Its ultimate fate was almost completely random. Just take this one song, Lockdown. In that independent world where people judged it purely on its own merits, it was perfectly average, dead in the middle, ranked 26th. But in one of the social worlds, it was the #1 smash hit. And in another social world, it was a total failure, down at number 40. The exact same song, the same quality, but wildly different outcomes, all because of luck. One of the researchers, Matthew Salganek, put it perfectly. He said it's like luck is more important for good songs than it is for bad ones. If a song is just terrible, it's going to fail no matter what. But if it's good,
then its success is basically a lottery.
Okay, so if luck is this powerful, why are we all so convinced that success is all about skill and talent and hard work? Well, the answer isn't really out there in the world, it's inside our own heads.
It boils down to this powerful psychological glitch called the fundamental attribution error. When we see someone succeed, our brain's default setting is to explain it by looking at them, their genius, their drive, their character. We tell ourselves a nice, neat story about skill, because it's a lot harder and frankly more unsettling to accept the huge, messy role of just random chance.
And what's really fascinating is how our idea of skill actually follows success, not the other way around. Look at Oberlin College. It used to be ranked number 5, and everyone agreed it was an amazing school. Then, U.S. News changed how they calculated the rankings, and Oberlin dropped. Now, did the school itself get any worse overnight? Of course not. But its reputation started to fall right along with its ranking. It shows us something profound. Often, we don't think things are successful because they're good. We think they're good because they became successful.
So, the next time you see a blockbuster movie, a best-selling book, or a viral star, remember that invisible but incredibly powerful hand of luck. And it leaves all of us with a pretty tough question to think about. When you look at your own life and your own achievements, what's the real score between your skill and just plain old good luck?
You know, we're swimming in statistics every single day, in sports, in business, you name it. But here's the thing. Not all stats are created equal. Some can point you to the truth, while others, well, they can be seriously misleading. So how do you tell the difference? How do you spot a useful stat from a useless one? That's what we're here to do. We're going to build a toolkit to help you see through the noise. All right, here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with a story about a CEO whose good intentions went a little sideways. Then we'll get to the core of it, the 2 simple but super powerful tests that any good statistic has to pass. We'll see this in action with the classic Moneyball story, uncover a huge blind spot in the business world, and then wrap it all up by handing you your very own statistical toolkit. So let's start with a classic example of how even the best intentions can lead to some pretty bad outcomes when you're measuring the wrong thing. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer, right? Of course, better quality is better for business. There was a video game CEO who thought exactly that. He actually tied his executives' bonuses to getting high Metacritic scores, all in the name of long-term stockholder value. But here's the question. Is a high review score really the best way to measure that? And this brings us to the wild story of the Wallace Company. In 1990, these guys won the most prestigious award for quality in the entire United States. They were at the top of their game. But just 2 years later, they filed for bankruptcy. What happened? Well, the cost of achieving that award-winning quality was so incredibly high that their customers just weren't willing to pay for it. It's a perfect, if painful, example of how focusing on a metric, even a noble one like quality, can completely backfire if it's not the right metric. So that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we find the right metrics? Turns out, it all comes down to a really simple framework. Any statistic worth its salt, no matter what you're talking about, has to pass 2 basic tests. Okay, test number 1 is for persistence. And really, this is just a fancy way of asking, are we measuring skill or are we just measuring luck? Think about an Olympic sprinter. If you time her 100-meter dash today and then again tomorrow, the times are going to be almost identical. That's persistence. It shows her performance is based on real, repeatable skill. If a stat isn't persistent, it means luck is playing a massive role. Test number 2 is for predictability. This one's all about value. It asks, does this statistic actually have a connection to the outcome you really care about? For a basketball player, shooting percentage is a super predictive stat because, well, a higher percentage directly leads to scoring more points, and scoring more points is the whole goal of the game. So how do we actually put a number on these things? Statisticians use a little something called the correlation coefficient, which they just label with the letter R. It's simply a tool to measure the strength of the relationship between 2 different things. And R is pretty straightforward. It goes from -1 all the way up to +1. A perfect 1.00 means you have a perfect positive relationship. Every time one thing goes up, the other goes up right along with it. A value down near 0 means there's pretty much no relationship at all. So for what we're doing, the closer R gets to 1, the better. It means the stat is more persistent or more predictive. Okay, enough with the theory. Let's see this framework in action with a real-world story you've probably heard of. The whole Moneyball phenomenon is the perfect case study for our 2-part test.
For literally decades, batting average was considered the gold standard for judging a baseball hitter. But look what happens when you actually test it for persistence. You plot a player's batting average one year against his average the next year, and the dots are all over the place. The correlation is a measly 0.37. That tells you it's not a very persistent skill. A player's performance one year doesn't really tell you much about the next, which means luck is a huge factor.
Now check this out. Compare that mess to a player's strikeout rate. See how tightly those dots are clustered along a straight line? The correlation here is a really strong 0.77. What does that mean? It means a player's ability to not strike out is a highly persistent skill. It's way more reliable and way less influenced by luck than his batting average.
Okay, so we passed the first test. We found stats that are persistent. They reflect actual skill. But now for the big one, the second test. Do these stats actually predict what leads to winning baseball games? And what leads to winning? Scoring runs.
And this is where it gets really cool. On the left, you can see that batting average does have a pretty strong link to scoring runs, an R of 0.81. Not bad. But now look at the chart on the right. On-base percentage, which is just how often a guy gets on base period, has an unbelievably strong correlation of 0.92 with runs scored. It is a way better predictor of a team's ability to put points on the board. And that, my friends, was the big secret of Moneyball. It's all right here on this chart. On-base percentage lives in that beautiful top right quadrant. It's more persistent than batting average, meaning it's a better measure of skill, and it's way more predictive of scoring runs. The Oakland A's figured this out, and they built a winning team by grabbing players with high on-base percentages that every other team was overlooking. Okay, so now that we have this awesome toolkit, let's take it out of the ballpark and apply it to the corporate world, where, it turns out, there's a pretty massive blind spot. Just let this quote sink in for a second. It's from a survey of over 400 top financial executives. It points directly at the most popular metric in the business world, earnings per share, or EPS. But if focusing on it makes companies do terrible things, how useful can it really be? Let's put EPS to our two tests. And the results are, well, they're pretty shocking. On the left, you see the persistence of EPS growth from one year to the next. The correlation is actually negative. That means it's basically random. Past performance tells you nothing. Sales growth on the right is a little better, but it's still incredibly weak. This tells us that these metrics that everyone obsesses over are driven mostly by luck, not by any kind of repeatable skill. And believe it or not, this problem is even worse when it comes to investing. We've all heard that little disclaimer, right? Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Well, this slide is the reason why. The correlation between a mutual fund's performance in one period and its performance in the next is also negative. It's just a random cloud of dots. Chasing after a hot fund is a strategy that is based almost entirely on pure luck. So, after seeing where this works and where it fails spectacularly, let's pull it all together into a clear, simple toolkit that you can actually use. We've looked at baseball stats, corporate numbers, investment ratings. So what happens when we plot all of them on that same simple grid, the one that maps skill versus luck and predictive value? And here it is. This chart puts everything in its place. Up there in the top right, that's our sweet spot. That's where you find stats like on-base percentage, high and persistent skill, and highly predictive of success. And then way down in the bottom left, that's the danger zone. And what do we find there? Popular metrics like EPS growth. They're driven mostly by luck, and they have almost no predictive power for the goals that actually matter.
So, what's the bottom line? Here's what you need to remember. First, always test a statistic for persistence. Ask yourself, is this measuring skill or is it just luck? Second, test it for predictability. Does it actually have a real connection to your goal? Be really skeptical of popular metrics that can't pass both of those tests. And always remember, the stats you can truly trust live in that top right corner, high skill and high predictive value.
And that brings us to one final question. For you, I want you to think about the statistics that you use, the ones you trust to make important decisions at work, in your hobbies, anywhere. Now, put them to the test. Ask yourself honestly, are they persistent? And are they predictive? The answer might surprise you. So, how do we actually get better at something? I mean, how do we really improve, whether we're talking about surgery or investing or even just a hobby? You think it's simple, right? Just practice. But it turns out the right way to build a skill depends completely on what kind of game you're playing. The answer comes from this really surprising collaboration between two intellectual rivals, and it gives us this incredible framework for getting better at, well, pretty much anything. To figure this all out, we have to start with a true odd couple from the world of psychology. On one side, you've got Daniel Kahneman. He's famous for showing all the ways our intuition can trick us into making really predictable mistakes. So he's a big skeptic when it comes to expertise. And on the other side, you've got Gary Klein. He studied experts, firefighters, soldiers, and showed the unbelievable power of their gut feelings. He's the champion of intuition. I mean, these two couldn't have started from more opposite corners. So you can imagine when these two giants decided to work together, the academic world was basically expecting fireworks. A huge debate. But what actually happened was way more interesting than that. Get this, the title of their joint paper was A Failure to Disagree. I mean, seriously, despite their completely different starting points, they actually found common ground. And that created this fascinating puzzle. What on earth could the great skeptic and the great champion of intuition possibly agree on? It boiled down to two conditions. They agreed that for anyone, to develop real, reliable expertise, two things absolutely have to be true. First, the world you're working in has to be predictable. They called it a valid environment, where if you do X, Y consistently happens. You can think of it like a game that has stable rules. And second, you need tons of opportunities to practice where you get instant, honest feedback on how you did. If you've got both of those, yeah, you can become a true expert. But if you don't, your intuition is basically just guesswork. And this powerful idea, it gives us a brand new framework for thinking about improvement. It's a way to diagnose any activity to figure out what it's going to take to get better. It's called the luck-skill continuum. Okay, think of it like this. It's a spectrum, right? On one far end, you have games of pure skill, like chess. The rules never ever change, and the feedback is immediate. You lose a piece, you know right then you made a mistake. And on the other far end is pure luck, like playing the lottery. There is no strategy you can practice. The thing is, most of what we do in life falls somewhere in between these two extremes. And this distinction is absolutely critical. See, in skill-heavy environments, the feedback is clean. The rules are stable. The outcome is a direct reflection of your ability. Simple. But in luck-heavy environments, oh, it's messy. The rules can change, the feedback is what they call noisy, and a great outcome might just mean you got lucky. So that means the tools you need to get better have to be totally different depending on where you are on that spectrum. So let's start on that pure skills side of the continuum. For things like playing an instrument or sports or surgery, the undisputed #1 best tool for improvement is something called deliberate practice. Now, to get why this works, we gotta quickly talk about Kahneman's two systems of thinking. You have System 2, which is your slow, rational mind. That's the part that's working super hard when you're first learning to drive. Then you have System 1. That's your fast, automatic intuition. That's what lets an experienced driver just react instantly without even thinking. And the entire goal of deliberate practice is to train our fast, automatic System 1 so that it makes expert moves, all on its own. But here's the crucial point. This is not just mindless repetition. Deliberate practice has 4 key ingredients. It has to be structured, usually by a coach. It has to push you just beyond your comfort zone. It is exhausting. And most importantly, it relies on that immediate, accurate feedback. You know, the famous surgeon Atul Gawande tells this story where, even though he was already an elite surgeon, he hired a coach. And the coach pointed out these tiny little flaws, like his elbows were flying a little too high, things he could never see himself. That feedback is what took his skill to a whole other level. Now, this is probably where you're thinking about that famous 10,000-hour rule, right? The idea that if you just put in 10,000 hours of practice, you'll become an expert in anything. Well, it's a bit of an oversimplification. A big one, actually. Let's just look at the actual data for chess masters. The time it took them to reach that elite level ranged from just 3,000 hours all the way up to over 23,000 hours. The point is, there's no magic number. It's the quality and the intensity of the practice, guided by that critical feedback, that really makes the difference. Okay, let's move on to our second tool. What about complex jobs that aren't pure skill, but they have these really critical, repeatable steps? Well, for those, we turn to the humble but unbelievably powerful checklist. Take a look at this number, 40,000. For years, that's roughly how many people in the United States were dying every year from infections caused by central line catheters. I mean, these were routine procedures, and almost all of those deaths were preventable. A doctor named Peter Pronovost was just horrified by this. He realized that doctors obviously knew all these steps, but in the chaos and complexity of their work, they'd sometimes just forget one. So he created this incredibly simple 5-step checklist. I mean, look at it. This is not rocket science. It's basic hygiene. And the result? Once hospitals actually put this simple checklist into practice, the central line infection rate, the one that was killing 40,000 people a year, it plummeted. It dropped to almost zero. It was a mind-blowing victory for a simple piece of paper. But what about the other side of that continuum? What about activities like investing, where luck plays a massive role? In those games, the outcome can actually lie to you. So our third tool is to completely ignore short-term outcomes and instead focus obsessively on your process. This is probably the biggest insight of all. Imagine you're playing blackjack and you get a 17. The right move, the smart process, is to stand. But let's say you ask for a hit anyway, get a 4, and win with 21. You got a great outcome, but you made a terrible decision. Over time, that bad process will absolutely destroy you. In games of luck, you have to learn to trust your process, not your results. So what does a good process actually look like in a field like investing? Well, it tends to have 3 main pillars. First, sound analysis to find your edge. Second, managing your own psychology to avoid all those common biases. And third, navigating the organizational constraints that can push even smart people to make bad decisions just to fit in. And that psychological challenge is huge. As the legendary investor Seth Klarman puts it, you need a contrarian streak. You need the guts to bet against what everyone else is doing. But you also need a calculator, the disciplined analysis to make sure you're not just being different for the sake of being different. So there we have it, our 3 tools: deliberate practice, the checklist, and a focus on process. But the ultimate skill here isn't just knowing how to use them, it's knowing which one to use. It's about being able to correctly diagnose the game you're playing in the first place. So let's put it all together. Here's the toolkit. Are you in a stable, skill-based game, like a musician? Then your path is deliberate practice, and your results are your guide. Is your work full of critical, repeatable steps, like a pilot or that doctor we talked about? The checklist is your best friend, and compliance is your metric. And what if you're trying to navigate an unstable, luck-based world, like an investor? Then you got to forget about short-term results. Focus on your process and stick to it, no matter what. And that brings us to the final and most important question. Think about your career, your goals, the things that really matter most to you. Take a hard look and ask yourself, are they games of skill or are they games of luck? And maybe more importantly, are you using the right tools to win? Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're breaking down how you can deal with one of life's most mysterious forces, luck. Is it something that just happens to us, or can we actually do something about it? Well, let's find out. You gotta love this. This was the actual, real-life explanation from a guy in Spain who won the lottery. His logic? He dreamed of the number 7 for 7 straight nights. And, well, his math is, let's just say creative. It perfectly captures how we often think about luck. It's powerful, it's irrational, and it is absolutely fascinating. So that brings us to the big question, right? If luck is just so random, are we totally helpless? Well, the answer, maybe surprisingly, is yes, there is something we can do. Today, we're going to unpack a powerful 3-part framework for turning luck from this uncontrollable mystery into a factor you can actually manage. All right, our first rule is all about strategy, especially when you're in a competitive situation. The key insight here is that it's not always about playing harder. Sometimes it's about playing smarter by, changing the game itself. Think about the classic story of David and Goliath. Goliath expected one kind of fight, right? A straight-up test of brute strength. But David, being the underdog, knew he couldn't win that way. So what'd he do? He refused to play Goliath's game. He changed the rules, fought from a distance, and completely flipped the script. And that's the whole idea here. Now, what's really cool is we can actually quantify this idea with a simple military strategy game called Colonel Blotto. The rules are super straightforward. You have a fixed number of soldiers, and you have to figure out how to spread them across multiple battlefields. So, take a look at this example. Player A puts all their muscle onto one battlefield. They totally crush it there. But player B is playing a different game. They spread their soldiers out, winning the other 2 battlefields by just a thin margin. So, who wins the war? Player B does. It's not about winning the biggest single battle. It's about winning more battles overall. And this leads us to a really simple but incredibly powerful rule. If you're the favorite, if you're Goliath, you want to simplify the game. Force a direct, head-to-head fight where your strength will obviously win. But if you're the underdog, if you're David, you have to do the opposite. You must complicate things. Add more battlefields, make it messy, increase the role of chance. And you see this principle absolutely everywhere. In sports, you get underdog coaches using a dizzying number of complex plays to confuse stronger opponents. In business, disruptive innovators don't attack the market leader head-on. No way. They create a new, smaller battlefield, a market the big guys are ignoring, and they win there first. It even happens in war. Okay, so complicating the game can up your odds, but how do you know which complications are actually going to work? You can't just guess, and that leads us perfectly to rule number 2. Find the cause. This is all about swapping guesswork for real evidence to reduce luck's role even more. So check this out. An author was arguing with his editor over the best title for his book. So instead of just arguing, he ran a super simple experiment. He set up an online tournament, paid hundreds of people just a tiny bit of money to vote on different titles in these head-to-head matchups. For just a couple $100, he got real data on which title people actually preferred. And this really represents a huge shift in thinking. The old way is to predict and control, sit in a conference room and try to guess what the future holds. The new, way more effective way is to measure and react. You run small, cheap experiments, you see what reality tells you, and then you act on that hard data. And this isn't just a theory. Huge companies do this. Political campaigns do this. Yahoo ran an experiment that proved its ads really did increase a retailer's sales by 5%. A political campaign tested its TV ads and found out their effect completely vanished after just 2 weeks. I mean, imagine knowing that when you're managing a multi-million-dollar budget. Okay, on to our final rule. And this one's maybe the most profound. Because even when you change the game and even when you measure the results, some things are always going to be unpredictable. This rule is about managing risk when you just can't know everything. It's about knowing your limits. And this brings us right to Nassim Taleb's famous concept of black swans. These are those rare, super high-impact events that are basically impossible to predict. We're talking about things like the 2008 financial crisis or the invention of the internet. They just come out of nowhere, change everything, and our normal statistical models are totally blind to them. So, in a world where black swans exist, what's the one thing you have to avoid? It's this dangerous pattern right here. You see the small, steady gains, and then bam! A single catastrophic loss that just wipes everything out. Think about the banks before the 2008 crash. It all looks great and profitable, until suddenly it isn't. The really smart strategy is to flip that pattern on its head. You want to look for situations that are structured like this, a series of small, manageable costs or losses, but with the potential for one massive, game-changing win. This is the world of venture capital, of scientific research, of creative breakthroughs. So here's the crucial point. In this kind of world, success isn't about how often you win. It's about how big you win when you're right compared to how little you lose when you're wrong. That's the whole ballgame. So let's bring it all together. How do these 3 rules build into a single actionable strategy that you can use to manage luck in your own life? So here is your 3-part toolkit. First, you change the game to shift the odds in your favor. Second, you run experiments to find out what actually works instead of just guessing. And third, you structure your bets so you can survive the small losses while positioning yourself for that one massive win. This is how you go from being a victim of chance to a manager of luck. In the end, what this framework really shows us is that while we can't control luck, we are not helpless. You can't control the cards you're dealt in life, but you can 100% control how you play the hand. The only question left is, what's your strategy going to be?
Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about something that's, well, it's everywhere. It's this quiet force that's always shaping our world, but it's so easy to get wrong. It's called reversion to the mean, and it's the real reason why an absolutely amazing performance is usually followed by a more, average one, and why a terrible, horrible day is often followed by things getting better. So, what's this invisible force? Let's get into it.
Okay, so think about this. Have you ever seen it happen? You've got a star performer, right? Maybe at work, on a team, and they have a terrible month. Just awful. So the boss comes down hard on them, reads them the riot act, and what happens next month? Their performance bounces back. It totally feels like that tough feedback did the trick, doesn't it?
But then, what about the flip side? That same person has a record-breaking month, absolutely crushes it. They get a big bonus, praise in front of everyone, and then the very next month, their numbers dip. It's like, wait, did the praise actually make them lazy? It makes no sense. So what is really going on here?
Well, the answer to both of those puzzles, it lies in this one simple but incredibly powerful idea. And guess what? It has almost nothing to do with the punishment or the praise. It's all about understanding the two key ingredients that make up pretty much any result you see in the world.
Okay, so here's the official definition. At its heart, reversion to the mean is just a statistical thing. It's a tendency. Think of it like this. Say you have a student who's a solid B student. They usually get around an 80 on their tests. Then, one day, bam, they get a 95. Awesome. But odds are their next score is going to be closer to that 80 they usually get. Why? Because that 95 wasn't just their skill. It was their skill plus a healthy dose of good luck. And the one thing we know about luck, it comes and goes.
And this is the simple little equation that explains everything. Any outcome you ever see is just a mix of two things. Skill, which is pretty stable, right? And luck, which is totally random. So when you see a really, really good result, or a really, really bad one, you can bet there was a huge amount of good or bad luck involved. The skill part doesn't change much day to day, but the luck part does. So naturally, the next time the result just drifts back. It reverts to what you'd expect based on skill alone.
You know, this isn't some brand new idea. It was actually first figured out way back in the late 1800s by this super brilliant guy named Francis Galton, who, fun fact, was Charles Darwin's cousin. And you know how he stumbled upon this massive statistical concept? By studying something really simple, how tall parents and their kids were.
So what Galton found is laid out perfectly right here. This chart uses data from over 1,000 fathers and sons. And look, if you check out the tallest fathers, all the way up in that top right corner, you'll see their sons are still really tall, no doubt. But on average, they're a little bit shorter than their dads. They're closer to the average height for all the sons. And it works the other way too. The shortest fathers, their sons are still short, but they're usually a bit taller than their dads. Again, closer to the average. It's like a perfect picture of reversion to the mean in action.
Okay, so here's the tricky part. Reversion to the mean is a cold, hard statistical fact. But our brains, they are just not built to see it. We're wired to look for stories, for cause and effect. And because of that, this simple statistical idea creates three huge mental traps, three illusions, that totally mess with how we see reality.
So, these are the big three illusions. First, we invent causes that aren't there. Second, we get feedback totally wrong. And third, we misunderstand what's happening to the big picture. Let's break them down one by one.
Take a look at this statement. When you read that, your brain immediately kicks into gear, right? You start thinking, why is that? Is it because they don't want someone who's competitive? Or maybe they're looking for other qualities in a partner? Your mind just automatically starts trying to build a story to explain it.
And this is where the illusion gets exposed. The story on the left that sounds so intriguing, and the boring statistical fact on the right, they're just two different ways of saying the exact same thing. Because the intelligence scores of spouses aren't perfectly correlated, you're going to see reversion to the mean. That's it. There's no deep, complicated cause. It's just a quirk of the numbers. But man, our brains just hate the boring fact and can't get enough of the juicy story.
This brings us full circle, right back to that manager and the employee. We think our feedback is what's causing the change. When you yell at a pilot for a really bad landing and their next one is better, you think, see, my yelling worked. But look, that awful landing was probably their normal skill plus a whole lot of bad luck. The improvement wasn't because you yelled. It was because the bad luck went away. Same thing with praise. You praise a pilot for a perfect, buttery smooth landing. That was their skill plus a dose of good luck. The next landing is probably going to be more normal, just because the good luck ran out. It's not the feedback, it's just regression.
So the third big illusion is this idea that reversion to the mean is going to make everyone average, that we're all just headed for the middle. I mean, if you just look at the chart on the left, you might think that the range of heights is actually getting smaller. But then you look at the chart on the right. The overall distribution, the whole bell curve of heights for the sons, looks almost exactly the same as it did for the fathers. The variety is still there. So, why? Well, it's because while the son of a really tall guy might be a little shorter,
The son of an average guy might get a lucky growth spurt and end up being really tall. The individuals move around, but the whole system stays perfectly in balance.
Okay, so we've seen how our brains get tricked by all this. The big question is, what do we do about it? How can we use this idea to actually make smarter predictions? Well, it turns out there's a really cool tool for this. It helps us figure out how much of what we're seeing is real skill, and how much we need to shrink back to reality to account for all that random luck.
It all comes down to one question. How much does luck matter? In a sport like baseball, luck is a huge part of the game. A bad hop, a gust of wind. So reversion to the mean is really strong. But in a sport like basketball, skill is much more dominant. Luck is still there, but less so. So reversion is weaker. This reversion strength is what we're going to call the shrinkage factor. And it's the key to adjusting our expectations.
And here's the recipe for how we use it. To get a better guess at someone's true skill, you don't just look at what they did. No, you take a little bit of their actual result and you mix it with a little bit of the overall average for everyone. How much of each? That's what the shrinkage factor tells you. It's a way of pulling those crazy high or low results back down to earth. All right, let's make this concrete. Let's say your favorite baseball team just had a phenomenal season. They won almost 60% of their games, a winning percentage of .599. That is incredible. But the question is that how good they really are, or did they just get a little lucky this year?
We can actually get a pretty good estimate. The research says that for baseball, the shrinkage factor is about 0.7. So here's what we do. Step 1, we take 70% of the team's incredible record. Step 2, we take the other 30% of the league average, which is just .500, winning half your games. Step 3, we just add those two pieces together, and that gives us a much better guess.
And when you do the math, what do you get? You get .568. That's our smarter, more realistic estimate of the team's actual skill level. So that amazing .599 season, it was probably their fantastic skill, plus about 5 extra wins that came from just pure dumb luck. So yeah, we should expect them to be a really good team next year, but probably not quite as good as they were this year.
And really, this is the most important thing to take away from all of this. It's simple. Don't overreact. When you see a crazy result, whether it's a massive win or a spectacular failure, just take a breath. Remind yourself that it's almost certainly a mix of real skill and a whole lot of random luck. The luck, good or bad, is going to fade. And the next result? It's probably going to be a lot closer to normal.
So I'll leave you with this question to think about. The next time you see a fund manager who had one killer year, or a startup with one runaway hit product, or hey, even when you look at one of your own big successes, ask yourself this. Understanding this one idea, reversion to the mean, it doesn't just make you smarter about stats. It gives you a more realistic and, frankly, a much wiser way to see the world, and even to see yourself. Thanks so much for tuning in.
All right, welcome back. So today we're going to get into something huge. How do we tell the difference between real, genuine skill and just plain old dumb luck? I mean, think about it. Nailing this is the key to making way better decisions in pretty much everything. And that's exactly what we're here to do. Build a toolkit for it. Okay, so to really get this, let's start with a story. You might have heard of it from the book Moneyball. Michael Lewis paints this incredible picture of a showdown inside the Oakland A's front office. You've got the old school scouts on one side of the room, and on the other you've got the general manager, Billy Beane. And he drops this legendary line on them, basically telling them, hey, we're not judging these guys on how good they look in a pair of jeans. We're judging them on what they can actually do on the field. And right there, that's the core of the whole thing, isn't it? You had the scouts who were all about their gut feeling, their decades of experience, what they saw with their own two eyes. But Billy Beane's team? Nah. They trusted the numbers. They figured out that the old way of doing things was just riddled with biases, making them fall in love with some players and totally overlook others. So they used spats to find those diamonds in the rough that everyone else was missing. I mean, that whole Moneyball story just shows you how incredibly tricky this is. But it begs the question, right? Why is it so hard for us? Why do our own brains get in the way and make it so easy for us to get fooled? Well, it turns out the biggest roadblock is, it's us. It's our own psychology. Look, our brains are amazing, right? But they're also wired with all these little mental shortcuts to help us process the world super fast. And 99% of the time, that's great. But when you're trying to untangle skill from luck, oh man, those same shortcuts can send you completely off the rails. You see, our brains are basically story-making machines. We can't help it. We have this deep, deep need for a cause for every single effect. Something happens, and bam, we instantly cook up a story to explain why. And here's the dangerous part. We get so good at it that we start seeing patterns and causes even in pure random noise. And once we've got a story we like, forget it. We'll ignore any piece of data that doesn't fit the narrative. So, one of the biggest traps here is something called recency bias. We are absolutely obsessed with whatever just happened. Think about it in sports. A baseball player goes on a hot streak, gets a few lucky bounces, and suddenly we're all talking like he's the next Hall of Famer. We completely forget that for the last 2 years, he was, just average. The recent shiny thing blinds us to the long, boring truth. And then you've got this other fun one, the belief in the law of small numbers. It's a fancy way of saying our brains have this awful habit of taking a tiny, tiny sliver of information and acting like it's the gospel truth. A pitcher strikes out the same batter twice in a row, and what do? We yell at the TV, he's got his number, he owns him, when in reality, a sample size of 2 is, well, it's basically meaningless. So, if our brains are kind of wired to fail at this, what are we supposed to do? How do we fight back? Well, we need a better mental model. We need a framework to help us map things out and see where an activity really sits on that spectrum between skill and luck. And that brings us to this idea of the luck-skill continuum. Just picture a straight line, right? On the far left, you have activities that are 100% pure luck. On the far right, 100% pure skill. The thing is, almost everything important in life doesn't live at the extremes. It's somewhere in that messy middle. So, let's think about where things fall on this line. Playing the lottery? Yeah, that's way over on the pure luck end. No skill there. Running a 100-meter dash against the clock? That's almost all skill. But what about the really complex stuff, like running a business, or investing in the stock market, or even playing a game of poker? That's where it gets interesting. All of that stuff lives right in that messy middle, where skill and luck are just constantly intertwined. And this is maybe the most important part of the whole thing. How you get better at something depends completely on where it is on that continuum. On the skill side, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's all about deliberate practice, getting clear feedback, and repeating. But when you move toward the luck side, things get weird. The link between what you did and what happened gets all fuzzy. You can have a brilliant process and still get a terrible result. And that means you have to switch your focus. You have to stop obsessing over the outcome and start obsessing over the quality of your process. Okay, so now we have our framework, we have the continuum. Let's make this really practical. I'm going to give you 3 simple rules you can start using today to get better at navigating this messy world. Seriously, think of these next 3 rules as your personal toolkit for good guesswork. They're designed to help you cut through all the noise, avoid those psychological traps we talked about, and just make fundamentally smarter judgments. Let's get into it. Rule number 1, assess your sample size. We have got to fight that urge to jump to conclusions based on tiny scraps of information. You have to get in the habit of constantly asking yourself, is this enough data to actually mean something? Because trust me, small sample sizes aren't just a little off. They can be wildly, dangerously misleading. So the natural question is, how big is big enough? Well, it all depends on how much luck is involved. Let's go back to baseball. A pitcher's ability to strike out batters, that's mostly skill. The data stabilizes and tells you something real after only about 100 at-bats. But what about a hitter's batting average on balls they actually hit into the field? That stat is loaded with luck. Bad bounces, great defensive plays. So for that number to become predictive, you need around 1,100 at-bats. That just shows you how much luck can distort things. Okay, rule number 2. Always compare to a baseline. A result on its own, floating in space, is meaningless. To know if skill is at play, you have to have something to compare it against. And it all comes down to asking one simple but incredibly powerful question. The old-timey comedian Henny Youngman was famous for his one-liners. And it turns out he accidentally stumbled onto one of the most profound ideas in statistics. Whenever someone would ask him, "Hey, Henny, how's your wife?" he'd fire back with, "Compared to what?" And that's it. That's the question. That's the essence of the null hypothesis. You have to ask, is this result I'm seeing actually special, or is it just something that could have happened by random chance alone? Compared to what should be your mantra. Let's look at a real-world example of this with mutual funds. So researchers looked at how many funds managed to beat the market for several years in a row. Now look at this table. The column actual funds is, well, it's the number that actually did it in the real world. But the next column, expected by chance, that's the baseline. That's how many winners you'd get if it was all just a coin flip, pure luck. And just look, at every single level, from a 5-year streak to a 9-year streak, the number of actual winners is way, way higher than what chance would predict. That's a pretty big flashing sign that tells you skill is a real factor here. All right, and that leads us right into our third and final rule. This is a big one. You have to understand and really respect one of the most powerful and, honestly, counterintuitive forces in the universe, reversion to the mean. So what is that? It's actually pretty simple. It just means that extreme results, they tend to be followed by more average results. Think about it. If a student who normally gets around a 70 on tests suddenly pulls a 95, what's more likely on the next test? Another 95 or something closer to their usual 70? It's almost always going to be closer to the average. And it works for bad luck too. Why? Because extreme performances, both good and bad, usually have a big dose of luck mixed in. And luck, by its very nature, doesn't hang around. Okay, so we've gone through the biases, the continuum, the 3 rules. What does this all add up to? What's the big idea we should walk away with? I think this quote from the neuroscientist Horace Barlow just nails it. He said, "Intelligence is the art of good guesswork." It's not about being a human encyclopedia with all the facts. Real intelligence is about becoming a master guesser. It's about developing the wisdom to know when you're seeing a real signal and having the humility to admit when it's probably just noise. So I'm going to leave you with a question to chew on. Think about your own life, your job, your investments, maybe even a hobby you're passionate about. Where are you telling yourself a neat little story about your own skill, when in reality, luck might be doing most of the talking? Being honest with yourself about that, that's the first real step toward making better guesses, and ultimately, better decisions in everything you do. Thanks so much for joining me.